Ethan and Natalie Thompson had been looking forward to this trip for weeks. The couple, both accomplished professionals, rarely had time to escape their demanding schedules. Ethan, a tech entrepreneur, had spent the last several months closing a major deal, while Natalie, a well-respected attorney, had been locked in back-to-back court cases. This weekend getaway was supposed to be their moment to breathe, a rare pocket of tranquility away from the pressures of their high-stakes careers. The airport had been uneventful. Their first-class tickets were scanned at the gate without issue, and they had boarded with the quiet confidence of people who belonged. As they stepped onto the plane, the familiar hum of the cabin settled over them, a promise of smooth skies and undisturbed rest. The plush seats, the soft glow of the cabin lights, and the neatly arranged menus all signaled that they were in for a comfortable journey. But comfort was short-lived. Just as Ethan adjusted his seatbelt and Natalie reached for the complimentary drink menu, a shadow loomed over them. A flight attendant, her name tag reading Samantha Grayson, stood rigidly in the aisle, her posture tight and her expression unreadable. "I need to see your tickets again," she said, her voice clipped and professional, but with a sharp edge that set off alarm bells in Ethan's mind. Ethan glanced up, confusion flickering across his face. "Of course," he said smoothly, reaching into his jacket pocket. Beside him, Natalie did the same, handing over her ticket with a quiet but firm demeanor. Samantha took the tickets with stiff fingers, her gaze scanning the boarding passes with a frown that deepened by the second. She flipped them over, checked the seat numbers, and then, without a word, handed them back. "I'll be back," she muttered, and turned on her heel, disappearing toward the galley. Natalie turned to Ethan, her brow furrowed. "That was odd." Ethan exhaled, glancing around. Passengers nearby had paused their conversations, their eyes darting toward the exchange. The tension in the air was palpable, thick like a brewing storm. "We've done nothing wrong," Ethan murmured, trying to keep his voice even. "Let's just wait." But waiting only made it worse. Minutes ticked by, stretching longer with each passing second. Samantha returned, but this time her energy was different, more rigid, more forceful. "I'm going to need you both to come with me," she said, her voice louder now, drawing even more attention. "There seems to be an issue with your seating." Natalie sat up straighter, her lawyer instincts kicking in. "Our tickets are for these seats," she said carefully. "There shouldn't be an issue." Samantha didn't budge. "We can sort it out in the galley," she replied, her tone cold, her posture commanding. Ethan inhaled slowly. He wasn't a confrontational man, but he recognized when something wasn't right. And this? This wasn't right. Still, he knew better than to escalate, at least not yet. Exchanging a brief glance with Natalie, he unbuckled his seatbelt and rose, his movements deliberate. Natalie followed, lifting her bag with controlled grace, her jaw set. The walk to the galley felt longer than it should have. The aisle stretched before them like an endless corridor of judgment, eyes watching, whispers growing. They passed passengers who now looked at them with curiosity, some with silent support, others with quiet skepticism. At the galley, Samantha turned to face them, folding her arms across her chest. The sterile glow of the overhead lights cast sharp angles on her face, making her look even more severe. "There's been a mistake," she said flatly. "These seats aren't yours." Natalie narrowed her eyes, her lawyer instincts firing on all cylinders. "Our tickets were scanned and confirmed at the gate," she countered. "There's no mistake." Samantha squared her shoulders. "I'm going to have to involve security if you don't comply." Ethan's expression remained unreadable, but his fingers twitched slightly at his sides. There it was, the threat, the moment that turned an inconvenience into an incident. Before he could speak, Natalie pulled out her phone. "I think it's time we called someone who can clarify this," she said smoothly, dialing a number with practiced ease. Samantha's frown deepened. "Who are you calling?" Natalie didn't answer. She pressed the phone to her ear, her expression calm but unshakable. "Hello?" she said after a moment. "I'm on flight 278, first class. My husband and I are being told we cannot remain in our seats despite holding valid tickets. Could you assist us?" A flicker of something, uncertainty, doubt, flashed across Samantha's face. Ethan watched the shift with quiet calculation. He knew that Samantha had expected them to comply without question, to get up, step aside, and disappear. But now she was losing control. Natalie continued speaking, her tone polite but firm. She ended the call, sent a quick text, and then waited. Samantha's patience was wearing thin. "This won't change anything," she snapped, her voice betraying a sliver of unease. Ethan met her gaze. "Are you sure about that?" Silence. Back in the first-class cabin, the murmurs had grown louder. Passengers who had tried to mind their business were now fully invested in the unfolding situation. One man, seated across the aisle from where Ethan and Natalie had been, leaned toward a flight attendant named Chloe, his voice low. "This doesn't feel right," he murmured. Chloe, who had been quietly observing from the start, nodded slightly. Samantha turned toward the galley phone, her fingers gripping the receiver a little too tightly. "This is Samantha, first-class cabin," she said briskly. "I need security at gate 17 immediately. We have 2 passengers refusing to comply." Natalie and Ethan exchanged a glance. Ethan sighed, slipping his phone from his pocket, the red recording light blinking steadily. Natalie, ever composed, simply whispered, 7 minutes. Ethan smirked, barely perceptible. He knew exactly what she meant. Samantha thought she had power, but she had no idea what was coming next. What do you think? Should Samantha have handled this differently? Drop a comment below, like this post if you believe in fairness and accountability. Subscribe to the channel for more eye-opening stories like this one, because sometimes the truth needs to be told. Ethan and Natalie Thompson stood in the narrow galley, surrounded by the quiet hum of the airplane. The tension between them and flight attendant Samantha Grayson had thickened, filling the small space like an invisible storm. Every move, every word felt measured, deliberate, a fragile balance between escalation and control. Samantha had just made the ultimate threat, calling security. A lesser person might have panicked, raised their voice, or pleaded to avoid humiliation. But not Ethan, not Natalie. Instead, they stood their ground. Natalie's posture was impeccable, her lawyer instincts fully engaged. Ethan remained composed beside her, his phone recording the encounter with silent precision. Every second that passed, every word spoken, was being captured, preserved. And Samantha knew it. Her face was tight, her grip on the in-flight phone tense. She had expected compliance, an apology, a retreat. But she was facing something entirely different. Calm resistance. "Security will be here shortly," Samantha said, attempting to inject authority into her voice. "You'll need to come with them." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Will we?" Samantha blinked, her confidence flickering. "Yes," she snapped. "Passengers refusing to comply with crew instructions are removed from flights." "But you haven't given us a valid reason to move," Natalie said smoothly. "Our tickets are valid. You haven't explained why we're being removed. What exactly do you plan to tell security when they get here?" The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. Passengers in the first-class cabin were leaning forward, some openly watching, others pretending to be absorbed in their screens while stealing glances toward the galley. The whispers had grown louder. A businessman in seat 3B adjusted his tie, glancing at his seatmate. "This doesn't seem right," he murmured. A woman nearby shook her head, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't like this at all." Back in the galley, Samantha shifted uncomfortably. She wasn't just dealing with 2 passengers anymore. She was performing for an audience, and she was losing them. Natalie's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and gave the smallest nod. Ethan noticed. The moment had arrived. Natalie lifted her phone, her voice cool, controlled. "I just received confirmation. I've spoken with the airline's executive office. They're aware of this situation. A supervisor will be waiting when we land." Samantha's entire demeanor changed. Her fingers twitched. Her lips parted slightly, as if searching for the right response. Ethan took a step forward, just enough to close the space between them, but not enough to threaten. His voice was soft, but the weight behind it was impossible to ignore. "You see, Samantha," he said, "this isn't going the way you thought it would." Silence. Outside the galley, the murmurs in the cabin had stopped. People were listening now. The passengers who had been uncertain, who had hesitated to take a side, were beginning to see it clearly. Something was very wrong. Samantha's face hardened, her pride battling her reality. She still had her authority, but she could feel it slipping. Every second that Ethan and Natalie stood unshaken, every moment they refused to back down, was another moment that her control unraveled. Sir, ma'am, she tried again, but her voice had lost its earlier force. I'm asking you one last time to return to the terminal voluntarily before security arrives. Natalie met her eyes, a soft smile tugging at the corner of her lips. Not amused, not mocking, just knowing. Oh, Natalie said gently, we'll wait. Ethan crossed his arms, shifting his weight slightly. We're not going anywhere. And with those 5 words, the entire plane held its breath. Samantha had lost. But she didn't realize just how much she had lost. Not yet. The minutes stretched on, heavy and charged. Passengers exchanged glances. The businessman in 3B exhaled sharply and muttered, well, this is going to be interesting. The woman beside him, no longer pretending to scroll through her tablet, murmured back, I'd be nervous if I were her. Another buzz from Natalie's phone. A final message. Ethan saw it, his lips curved into the smallest smirk. Natalie turned towards Samantha, her voice eerily calm. I think you'll want to take that call. Samantha blinked. What? The captain just radioed in, Natalie said, slipping her phone back into her bag. Headquarters has instructed him to handle this situation immediately. And then, as if on cue, the phone in the galley rang. Samantha jerked toward it, her face pale. She hesitated. Passengers held their breath. The businessman in 3B whispered, oh, she's in trouble now. The call continued ringing. Ethan's voice was soft, almost sympathetic. You should probably answer that. Samantha's fingers trembled as she lifted the receiver. This is Samantha, she said, voice tight. A long pause, then her face changed. Her knuckles went white. Her eyes darted toward Ethan and Natalie, and for the first time she looked afraid. Yes, sir, she whispered. I understand. Another pause, a sharp inhale. Yes, right away. She hung up slowly as if dreading the moment her hand left the phone. Silence. Passengers watched, waiting. Samantha turned to face them, her shoulders tight with tension. She inhaled through her nose, then exhaled shakily. There has been a mistake, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. A ripple of energy swept through the cabin. Natalie lifted an eyebrow. A mistake? Samantha swallowed hard. You're free to return to your seats. The businessman in 3B muttered, you don't say. A slow, quiet wave of realization passed over the passengers. Those who had watched the drama unfold, who had heard the sharp accusations, the demands for removal, the threats of security, now saw something entirely different. A complete reversal. Ethan pocketed his phone. That's what I thought. Natalie gave Samantha one last, lingering look. Then with absolute grace, she turned and walked back toward her seat. Ethan followed, the weight of every eye in first class locked onto them. And as they sat down, one final whisper floated through the cabin. She had no idea who she was messing with. Ethan and Natalie sat back in their seats, calm, composed, unshaken. But the atmosphere in the cabin had changed. Tension rippled through the air like static before a storm. Passengers who had once been lost in their own worlds of emails, movies, and pre-flight cocktails were now silent observers, their focus locked on the unfolding scene. The whispers started slowly. Did you hear that? She said their seats aren't valid. They literally showed her the tickets. She checked them twice. This isn't right. Some passengers shifted in their seats. Others exchanged glances, silently asking the same question. What's really going on here? Across the aisle, an older gentleman named Richard Harper, a retired judge with a keen sense for when something wasn't adding up, narrowed his eyes at the flight attendant, Samantha Grayson. His wife, Evelyn, a woman whose intuition was as sharp as her wit, leaned in and whispered, she doesn't like them being here. Richard nodded slowly. That's what I'm seeing too. Just a few rows back, a younger woman, Jessica, who had spent most of her time scrolling through her phone, paused mid-scroll. She had been vaguely aware of the rising tension, but hadn't fully tuned in, until now. As she removed her earbuds, she caught the nervous glance of another passenger, a middle-aged man in a navy blazer. Did I miss something? She murmured. The man, who had been watching closely, leaned in. The flight attendant is trying to force them out of first class, but their tickets are valid. Jessica frowned. Seriously? Yeah, and she's calling security now. Jessica's stomach twisted uncomfortably. That didn't sit right with her. She had seen things like this before. People in power using thin excuses to remove someone they just didn't want around. She didn't like it then, and she didn't like it now. Up front, the quiet unease was spreading like wildfire. Meanwhile, in the galley, Samantha gripped the phone tighter, as if the plastic receiver might anchor her against the shift in power. She wasn't used to being questioned. She was the authority here. But now she could feel it slipping through her fingers. She turned to her fellow flight attendant, Clara, who had been watching everything from the sidelines. "Clara," Samantha snapped, her voice lower now. "Back me up here." Clara hesitated. She had been working flights long enough to trust her instincts, and right now her instincts were screaming at her that this wasn't right. She had seen passengers removed before, usually for actual reasons: disruptive behavior, safety concerns, violations of policy. But this was different. Clara swallowed hard. "I don't know, Samantha. Their tickets checked out." Samantha's eyes flashed. "So? That doesn't mean anything." Clara felt her stomach turn. "What do you mean?" she asked carefully. Samantha exhaled sharply. "I mean, they could have gotten them through someone else, a mix-up at the gate. There are ways to get into first class without actually paying for it." Clara's breath caught. There it was. That wasn't about policy anymore. That was about assumption. Samantha wasn't questioning Ethan and Natalie because she had proof of wrongdoing. She was questioning them because something about them didn't fit her expectations. And Clara? Clara had had enough. Back in the cabin, Richard Harper finally decided he had seen enough. He unbuckled his seatbelt, stood, and adjusted his tie before walking with calm authority toward the galley. "Excuse me," he said, his voice steady but commanding. "What exactly seems to be the problem here?" Samantha stiffened, her eyes flicking toward the man now standing before her like a witness taking the stand. "It's a security matter, sir," she said, forcing politeness into her voice. Richard lifted a brow. "Sit? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like an unnecessary escalation against two passengers who have done nothing wrong." Behind him, Jessica stood too. Then the man in the navy blazer. Then Evelyn Harper. One by one, passengers began rising. Samantha's heart pounded. She had lost the cabin. Clara took a step forward. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. "Samantha," she said softly, "I think we need to reconsider this." Samantha turned sharply. "You're supposed to be on my side." Clara exhaled slowly. "I'm supposed to do what's right." The tension was unbearable now. Samantha's hand hovered near the phone. The security team was already on their way. But now she wasn't so sure she wanted them here. Because this wasn't just between her and Ethan and Natalie anymore. This was the entire cabin watching her. Passengers who had once ignored her commands were now challenging her. Jessica, arms crossed, looked Samantha in the eye. "Let me get this straight. They showed you their tickets, you checked them twice, and now you're still calling security? What are you hoping to prove?" Samantha's jaw locked. "It's not your concern." "Well, it is now," Richard Harper said firmly, "because now you're making it everyone's concern." Silence. Then, the phone rang. The sound cut through the tension like a knife. Samantha jumped, staring at the receiver like it had personally betrayed her. Clara reached for it first, before Samantha could stop her. "Hello, this is Clara," she said, her voice steady. A long pause, then, her eyes widened. Her gaze flickered toward Samantha, her expression unreadable. "Yes, Captain, understood." She hung up and turned back toward the group. "The captain wants to see you," she said to Samantha, her voice quiet. Samantha went still. The passengers, still standing, exchanged glances. The businessman in navy smirked. "That's not a good sign." Jessica grinned slightly. "Not for her, it isn't." Ethan and Natalie, still in their seats, watched the moment unfold. And just like that, the power in the cabin shifted. Passengers, once passive, were now engaged. Samantha had stepped into the aisle thinking she was in control. But now she was just another employee being called to answer for her actions. Ethan exhaled. He looked at Natalie, who gave him a small, knowing smile. "She's not getting out of this," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "No, she's not." And as Samantha disappeared behind the curtain toward the cockpit, the truth settled over the cabin like a verdict being read aloud. She had picked the wrong passengers to mess with. The air inside the first-class cabin was thick with tension, so dense that it felt like every passenger was holding their breath. Eyes darted nervously, shifting between the flight attendant, Samantha Grayson, and the couple at the center of the storm, Ethan and Natalie. Natalie's fingers hovered over her phone screen, her expression calm but unreadable. Across from her, Samantha stood with an air of authority, her uniform crisp, her posture stiff. She had made the call. Security was on their way. But what Samantha didn't know was that Natalie had made a call of her own, a call that would change everything. The tension had begun long before the call. Samantha's persistence in questioning Ethan and Natalie's right to their first-class seats had already stirred unease among the passengers. Some had exchanged skeptical glances, others whispered among themselves, and a few, like Richard Harper, the retired judge, had already begun connecting the dots. Still, no one had expected Samantha to escalate it further. And yet, here they were. Samantha had dialed security with confidence, believing that in a matter of minutes, Ethan and Natalie would be escorted off the plane, their humiliation complete. Natalie, however, had not flinched. Instead, she had reached for her phone, swift and silent, and pressed a single contact. A number few people had access to. A number that had the power to flip the script entirely. Her phone barely rang before it was answered. "Hello," came a voice, measured, professional, yet familiar. Natalie leaned back in her seat, crossing one leg over the other, her voice steady, unwavering. "I need a favor," she said. Samantha frowned, suddenly aware that she might not have been the only one making a move. "I'm on flight 387, Natalie continued, speaking as if she were discussing a minor inconvenience, rather than a direct threat to her dignity. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "The one heading to New York?" Natalie's lips twitched. "Yes, there's a situation." A breath, then a quiet but distinct shift in tone. "What kind of situation?" Natalie's gaze flicked up, meeting Samantha's sharp stare. "A flight attendant is attempting to remove me and my husband from first class," she said, her voice just loud enough that those nearby could hear. Despite our tickets being valid, Samantha's jaw tightened. Passengers leaned in, sensing the unraveling of control. The voice on the other end went silent for a moment. Then, "Give me 30 seconds. Click. The line went dead. Natalie slipped her phone back into her bag, her posture still composed. Ethan, beside her, let out a quiet breath, his eyes filled with something Samantha couldn't quite place. Amusement? No. Anticipation. Samantha turned away sharply, masking her unease with impatience. She didn't care who Natalie had called. It didn't matter. Security would arrive any moment, and then this would be over. Wouldn't it? The phone in the galley rang. Samantha's entire body stiffened. Passengers startled at the sharp chime, their heads snapping toward the galley like spectators watching a final chess move. Jessica, the woman who had been watching closely from a few rows back, turned to Richard Harper. "She doesn't look so sure of herself anymore," she whispered. Richard nodded. "Because she isn't." "I..." Samantha swallowed, palms suddenly sweaty. Slowly, she reached for the phone, forcing calm into her voice as she lifted the receiver. "This is Samantha," she said. The response on the other end was immediate. "Samantha Grayson?" "Yes." "This is Jonathan Price, Vice President of Operations." Samantha went rigid. Passengers watched as her face drained of color. "Yes, sir," she stammered, her fingers tightening around the phone. "I've just been informed that you attempted to have 2 passengers removed from their assigned seats," Price continued, his voice dangerously even. "Would you care to explain why?" Samantha stammered for an answer. There was confusion with their tickets, sir." "Their tickets are fully valid." A pause. Then an order. "You will immediately cease all further action against Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," Price continued, his tone absolute. "You will apologize for your mistake and ensure they have a comfortable flight for the remainder of the journey." Samantha froze. Passengers held their breath. Then Price added one last instruction. "Oh, and Samantha?" "Yes, sir. You will report to your supervisor upon landing. We will be conducting a formal review of your actions." The blood drained from Samantha's face. "Yes, sir," she whispered. Click. The call ended, and with it, Samantha's sense of control. Samantha lowered the phone slowly, her hands trembling slightly as she turned back toward the cabin. Every single passenger was watching her, waiting. Ethan and Natalie sat perfectly still, their expressions unreadable. But their victory was undeniable. Jessica whispered, "Oh, I have to see this." Richard Harper crossed his arms, his expression one of quiet triumph. And Samantha? She had never felt smaller. She swallowed, forcing herself to take the longest walk of her life back to Ethan and Natalie's row. She cleared her throat, trying to regain her authority, but it was useless. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson," she began, her voice unsteady. I... She stopped herself. Her eyes met Natalie's. Calm, strong, waiting. She couldn't do this, and yet she had no choice. "I apologize," she said finally, "for the misunderstanding." A murmur rippled through the cabin. Ethan tilted his head. "Misunderstanding?" Natalie's lips curled ever so slightly. Samantha knew it wasn't enough. But she had nothing left. "Enjoy your flight," she finished weakly, before turning on her heel and retreating to the galley. As she vanished behind the curtain, a single slow clap echoed through the cabin. Then another, and another, until the entire first-class section erupted into applause. Natalie turned to Ethan, her voice soft, amused. "Well," she murmured, "that took less than 30 seconds." Ethan chuckled. "I hope she remembers it for the rest of her life." The tension in the first-class cabin had reached its breaking point. Every single passenger was watching, waiting, holding their breath as the weight of the situation bore down on the flight attendant, Linda. She had made the call to security. She had doubled down, insisting that James and Carla didn't belong in their seats. But now the captain himself was involved. A ripple of murmurs spread through the cabin as the cockpit door swung open. Captain Daniel Harrington, a seasoned pilot with decades of experience, stepped into the aisle with a kind of quiet authority that instantly commanded respect. He wasn't a man who liked interruption, nor was he the kind to tolerate unnecessary chaos. His piercing blue eyes scanned the cabin, locking onto the tense scene in front of him. Passengers fell silent. Linda, whose confidence had been waning since the phone call, stiffened at the sight of him. Her authority was slipping, and she knew it. The captain didn't rush. He walked slowly, deliberately, his presence alone enough to send a clear message. This flight belonged to him now, and he wasn't pleased. "Mr. and Mrs. Carter?" His deep voice cut through the thick air like a knife. He stopped just in front of James and Carla's row, his expression unreadable. James nodded, his face calm but firm. Carla, ever poised, met the captain's gaze with quiet confidence. "Yes, Captain," James replied. The captain's eyes flicked to Linda, who stood frozen, her hands clasped in front of her as if she were bracing for impact. "I've been informed that there is an issue with your seating arrangements," Captain Harrington said, his voice calm but edged with authority. Carla spoke first. "No issue from our end, Captain. We're simply sitting in the seats we paid for." The captain nodded once, then extended a hand. "May I see your boarding passes?" James reached into his jacket and handed them over without hesitation. The moment was crucial. Linda had already checked the tickets multiple times and had still called security. The first-class cabin held its breath. Captain Harrington examined the tickets carefully, his brow furrowing slightly as he read over the details. Then, without a word, he turned to Linda and held them out to her. "Do you see any issues here, Miss Grayson?" he asked, his tone razor-sharp. Linda's face drained of color. Her fingers trembled as she took the tickets, glancing over them as if hoping to find some mistake. But there was none. There had never been one. Passengers shifted in their seats, eyes darting between the captain and the flight attendant. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Linda cleared her throat. "No, sir," she murmured. The captain's jaw tightened. "Then explain to me, Berfame," he said, his voice low but dangerous, "why my first-class passengers were nearly removed from this flight under false pretenses." A deafening silence fell over the cabin. Linda's throat bobbed as she swallowed. She had no answer, because there was no answer. She had pushed too far, and now there was no escaping the consequences. Captain Harrington let the silence stretch, his presence heavy with disapproval. Then slowly he turned back to James and Carla, his voice calm but firm. "I apologize for this unacceptable disruption to your flight," he said, offering a nod of respect. "Please know that you are exactly where you belong." A murmur of agreement rippled through the cabin. Linda stiffened, her face burning under the weight of the moment. The captain turned to her once more. "Ms. Grayson," he said, his voice clipped, "please step into the galley. We'll discuss this privately." The finality in his tone sent a clear message. This wasn't just a scolding. This was the beginning of the end. Linda hesitated for only a moment before nodding stiffly. She turned on her heel and disappeared behind the curtain, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any words. Passengers exhaled. Jessica, who had been watching the entire exchange with wide eyes, let out a low whistle. "Wow," she murmured to the businessman beside her. "That was brutal." The businessman nodded, his lips curling into a smirk. It was deserved. Carla, ever composed, took a slow sip of her water, cool, collected, unshaken. James chuckled, leaning toward her. "Well, that was satisfying." Carla smiled, but her voice was measured. "Yes, but let's see what happens when we land." Because this wasn't over yet, not for Linda, and certainly not for the airline. The plane hummed steadily as it cruised through the sky, but inside the cabin, the energy had shifted. Passengers whispered, exchanging glances, their curiosity heightening as they watched Linda, the once authoritative flight attendant, slowly unravel. She had spent the entire flight believing she was in control, that her actions were justified, and that James and Carla would be the ones facing consequences. But now she was the one being summoned. As the intercom crackled to life, a calm but firm voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Miss Grayson, please report to the cockpit immediately." The words hit her like a punch to the stomach. Passengers stilled, a few exchanged knowing looks. Others simply watched, as if waiting for the final act of a story that had been building all flight long. Linda's breath caught in her throat. This was not standard procedure. In all her years working as a flight attendant, she had never been summoned mid-flight like this. Never. She stole a glance at James and Carla. Carla met her gaze with a look of quiet certainty, as if she had known this moment was coming and all along. James simply raised an eyebrow. Neither of them looked surprised. Linda's chest tightened. She forced her feet to move, trying to maintain her composure as she stepped away from the galley, past rows of passengers who had witnessed her mistake. The same passengers who had judged her actions, who had whispered among themselves about her behavior, who had already decided she was wrong. Her hands were clammy as she reached the cockpit door. She hesitated. Then with a deep breath, she knocked. "Enter." She stepped inside. The cockpit was cool and dimly lit, the glow of control panels illuminating the space. Captain Daniel Harrington sat in his chair, his uniform pristine, his demeanor unshaken. His co-pilot, a younger man named Evans, barely glanced at her, his attention on the flight controls. The captain turned slowly, his expression unreadable. "Miss Grayson," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Close the door." Linda did as she was told, her pulse hammering in her ears. The moment the latch clicked, the weight of reality settled over her. She wasn't being summoned for a routine discussion. This was something far worse. Captain Harrington folded his hands, his sharp gaze pinning her in place. "I received a call from headquarters," he began, his tone measured. "They've been monitoring this flight." Linda's stomach dropped. Her mind raced, searching for a way to control the situation, to fix it before it spiraled completely out of her hands. "Captain, Harrington held up a hand. The finality in the gesture silenced her immediately. "This isn't a discussion, Miss Grayson," he said. "It's a directive." The air in the cockpit felt thicker, heavier. Her throat tightened. "The airline has determined that your actions today were unacceptable," the captain continued, his voice cold and unwavering. "And as a result, you will be removed from duty the moment we land." Linda stared at him, her entire world tilting. "Removed? No, this couldn't be happening. This is a misunderstanding," she blurted out, her voice uneven, desperate. "I was following protocol." The captain's eyes hardened. "Protocol," he repeated, his voice now laced with quiet anger. "You accused two paying passengers of being in the wrong seats. You publicly humiliated them, called security, and escalated a situation that should never have existed." His words landed like blows. Linda's knees felt weak. She opened her mouth to argue, but there was nothing left to say. The truth was undeniable. The captain continued, his voice growing sharper. "Upon landing, security will escort you from the aircraft for questioning. A formal investigation has been launched, and your access to airline facilities has been suspended pending the review." The words sliced through her. Suspended, escorted off the plane. Her pride, her position, her authority, gone in an instant. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was career-ending. Her breath came faster, her mind spiraling. "I didn't mean for this to happen," she choked out. The captain's gaze remained cold. "No," he said. "You just didn't think you'd get caught." A beat of silence stretched between them. Then, without another word, Captain Harrington turned back to his controls. "Dismissed." Linda didn't move. Not at first, but she had no choice. With legs that felt like lead, she forced herself to turn, opening the cockpit door and stepping out into a plane full of watching eyes. A walk of shame. The passengers in first class had heard the intercom. They knew. As Linda made her way back down the aisle, she felt their eyes burn into her. Some passengers whispered not so quietly. Others didn't even bother hiding their smirks of satisfaction. Jessica, the woman who had been seated a few rows behind James and Carla, nudged the businessman beside her. "Well," she murmured, "I guess karma doesn't take vacations." The businessman chuckled, shaking his head. Linda kept walking, her heart pounding. She had never felt so small. Never imagined that she would be the one facing consequences. Her hands shook as she reached the galley, bracing herself against the counter, staring blankly at the beverage cart. Everything felt surreal. Just hours ago, she had been in control. Now, she was waiting for the moment she'd be escorted off the plane like a criminal. The plane began its descent, and passengers prepared to land. But Linda, she was preparing for something else entirely. Something she never saw coming. Linda had hoped that once she stepped off the plane, the nightmare would be over. That maybe, just maybe, this incident would fade into obscurity, a mistake that would be handled quietly behind the closed doors of the airline's corporate offices. She was wrong. By the time she stepped onto the jet bridge, flanked by security, the damage had already been done. Passengers had witnessed everything. The accusations, the humiliation, the moment she was stripped of authority by the captain himself. And they had filmed it all. The internet never forgets it started as a trickle, a handful of passengers uploading clips to social media, sharing their shock and outrage. But within hours, those videos had gone viral. Millions of people watched as Linda stood towering over James and Carla, her voice cold as she accused them of being in the wrong seats. They watched the way James remained calm, the way Carla held her ground, the moment security was called under false pretenses. And then they saw justice unfold in real time. The video of Captain Harrington exposing the truth of Linda standing frozen in humiliation as he confronted her became the defining moment. It was shared thousands of times, reposted by activists, journalists, and influencers. The hashtags began to spread. People weren't just angry, they were furious. Linda had believed that she was untouchable, that no one would question her decisions. Instead, she had become the face of a larger issue, a symbol of the abuse of power, of unchecked bias, of what happens when people assume authority means they are above consequences. And now, the whole world was watching. News outlets picked up the story within hours. What had started as a passenger complaint had turned into a national conversation. Major news channels aired the footage. Headlines called it an egregious abuse of power. Talk shows debated the deeper implications. How often did this happen to people who didn't have the means to fight back? How many times had someone like Linda gotten away with it before? The airline couldn't ignore it. They tried at first. A corporate spokesperson released a brief, vague statement saying the company was conducting an internal review and that they took all customer concerns seriously. But that wasn't enough. The backlash grew. People boycotted flights, customers canceled reservations, and employees started speaking out. Other crew members, current and former, came forward with their own stories, revealing that this wasn't an isolated incident. Linda had a history of questionable behavior, but until now, it had always been swept under the rug. Not this time. This time there was evidence, and people demanded accountability. 2 days later, the airline had no choice but to act. Their CEO released an official statement, standing in front of cameras, his expression grave. "What occurred on Flight 387 was unacceptable. We deeply regret the actions of our employee and the harm caused to Mr. and Mrs. Carter. Effective immediately, the flight attendant involved is no longer with our company. Linda was officially fired, but the damage wasn't just her reputation, it was the airline's. Carla and James weren't just seeking an apology, they wanted systemic change. Within a week, the airline announced mandatory bias training for all employees, a revised passenger complaint system, and an external audit of their hiring and disciplinary practices. And Carla? She wasn't done yet. Instead of stepping back into her quiet life as an attorney, Carla used the momentum of the public outrage to push for lasting change. She was invited to speak on news programs, sitting across from well-known anchors, as she explained why this wasn't just about one bad flight attendant. This happens more than people realize, she told one interviewer. This isn't just about what happened to my husband and me. It's about the culture that allows these things to happen. If we don't demand accountability, nothing changes. Her poise, her unshakable confidence, and the way she had handled herself during the flight made people listen. She wasn't just a victim of discrimination. She was a force for change. Her words were powerful, undeniable, and they were making a difference. As the world rallied behind James and Carla, Linda was nowhere to be found. Her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Messages from colleagues, former friends, strangers sending messages of hate, judgment, and even sympathy. Her name was trending. She had lost her job. Her career in the airline industry? Over. And when she went outside, she saw her own face staring back at her from newsstands. She had spent years believing that she was the authority, that she had the power to decide who belonged where. Now she was the one being judged. She sat alone in her apartment, scrolling through endless news articles and comment sections filled with rage. She had never felt so exposed, so powerless. And for the first time, she asked herself a question she had never considered before. Was I wrong? This wasn't just another internet scandal that would fade in a few days. This was bigger. Because it wasn't just about one flight, one mistake, one bad decision. It was about accountability. It was about people in power being held responsible. It was about forcing change where it had long been ignored. And thanks to James, Carla, and the voices of millions, that change had already begun. James and Carla had won their personal battle the moment Linda was removed from the airline. But for them, this wasn't just about justice for themselves, it was about something far bigger. How many people had been wrongfully humiliated before them? How many had suffered in silence, unable to fight back? As they sat in their home, reading through the thousands of messages pouring in from people who had experienced similar mistreatment, it became clear their fight was far from over. The public outrage had forced the airline's hand, but Carla wasn't naive. A PR stunt wasn't real change. A single apology, a few press releases, and a fired flight attendant wouldn't fix the system that allowed this to happen in the first place. She wasn't about to let this moment slip away. It was time to demand something bigger. 3 days after the airline's public statement, Carla's phone buzzed with an email from the airline's corporate office. Subject, request for discussion. Next steps. Carla read through the email carefully, her sharp lawyer's mind dissecting every word. It was sterile, carefully worded, an attempt to control the damage. We appreciate your patience as we conduct an internal review and would like to invite you to discuss how we can move forward in a way that reflects our company's commitment to fairness and inclusivity. James, reading over her shoulder, scoffed. They want this to go away. Carla smirked, a fire burning behind her eyes. Then we make sure it doesn't. She replied with a firm demand, a meeting with top executives, not PR representatives, a room full of decision makers, not damage controllers. Within hours, the airline agreed. The corporate headquarters was a towering glass building designed to impress and intimidate. But Carla and James weren't here to be impressed. They were here to make demands. As they stepped into the boardroom, a dozen men and women in suits sat waiting, their expressions neutral, but their body language stiff. They weren't comfortable. Carla liked that. The CEO, a polished man in his 50s, stood first. Mr. and Mrs. Carter, we appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Carla didn't waste time. Let's be clear, she said, her voice steady and unshaken. We're not here for an apology. We're here to ensure this never happens again. The CEO hesitated, then gestured for them to sit. James folded his arms, his gaze cold. Tell us, what are you doing to fix this? One of the executives, a woman with sharp cheekbones and carefully chosen words, jumped in. "We've implemented new training procedures." Carla cut her off. "Not enough." Oh, silence rippled across the room. "Training isn't enough," she continued. "Training is what companies do when they want good press, not real change." The executives exchanged glances. They weren't expecting Carla to take control of the meeting. She leaned forward, unflinching. "What we want is a real, enforceable policy, one that ensures employees like Linda can't act on bias without consequences." The CEO sighed, rubbing his temple. "And what exactly would that look like?" Carla pulled a folder from her bag. It contained everything. Mandatory bias training with certified specialists, not just a PowerPoint session. An independent review board for passenger complaints. A reporting system that ensures accusations are backed by evidence before action is taken. Clear consequences for employees who violate policies. She slid the document across the table. "This," she said, "this is how you stop what happened to us from happening again." The room was silent as the executives looked at the papers. They weren't just suggestions. They were demands. James sat back, watching as the weight of Carla's words sank in. Finally, the CEO exhaled sharply. "This is, a lot." Carla didn't blink. "It's necessary." The CEO looked around the table. His team wasn't arguing against it. They knew she was right. After a long pause, he nodded. "We'll review this and get back to you." James smiled slightly. Carla shook her head. "No," she said. "We're not waiting for a response. We'll be following up, and if we don't see action, we will take this to Congress. We have the support. We will escalate." Her words landed like a final verdict. The executives knew it. They had no choice but to act. Over the next 6 months, Carla and James kept the pressure on. The airline was forced to comply. Other airlines took notice and followed suit. The incident was referenced in policy changes nationwide. Carla didn't stop. She was invited to speak at aviation conferences about passenger rights. James began writing articles, shining a light on similar cases. What had started as a moment of injustice had turned into a movement, and people were listening. A message to the people. Months later, Carla stood before a packed auditorium, delivering a speech at a consumer rights conference. Behind her, a screen displayed the now famous video of Linda confronting them, and the captain calling her out. She looked at the crowd, her voice filled with conviction. "We live in a world where power often goes unchecked," she said, "and when people abuse that power, they expect silence, they expect compliance." She paused. "They didn't expect us." The crowd erupted in applause. Carla smiled, but it wasn't one of victory, it was one of determination. Because this fight wasn't over, it had only just begun. What do you think? Was this the right way to handle it? Should more companies be forced to change? Comment below. If you believe in holding people accountable. Subscribe for more powerful stories like this. Linda had always believed in control. She was the authority on every flight she worked, the one who enforced the rules, the one who decided who belonged where. She took pride in her ability to handle passengers, to keep order in the cabin. She thought she was doing her job, but the world didn't see it that way. When she stepped off that plane in disgrace, escorted by security, she still believed she could explain her way out of it. She would tell her supervisors she had been following protocol, that she had only been doing what was necessary. She didn't realize that the decision had already been made. The next morning, her phone rang. It was a brief, cold conversation with the airline's HR department. "Linda, after a thorough review of your actions on Flight 387, the board has decided to terminate your employment, effective immediately." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Wait!" She tried, but the voice on the other end was unwavering. "We'll send the formal letter. Your access to all company systems has already been revoked. Security will escort you when you come to return your uniform and ID badge." The call ended before she could argue. Just like that, her career was over. Linda had barely processed what had happened before her name became public. The viral videos had spread like wildfire. Not just on social media, but on the news. The headline was everywhere. "Flight attendant fired after humiliating first-class passengers." Her face was in the clips. Her voice was the one making accusations. Her actions were on display for the world to judge. At first, she refused to look at the comments. but she couldn't escape them. Hundreds of messages flooded her inbox, her social media pages, even her email. Some were angry. You got what you deserved. You thought you were untouchable? Think again. I hope you never work again. Others were harsher. This is what happens when you judge people based on skin color. You're exactly what's wrong with the world. Racist flight attendants like you should never be allowed near passengers. Linda's hands trembled as she scrolled. She wanted to scream that they were wrong. She wasn't racist. She wasn't malicious. She was just doing her job. Wasn't she? Then why had she been fired? Why was the whole world against her? She tried to move on. She updated her resume, applied to every airline she could think of. She got no responses. Her reputation had followed her. Other flight attendants had been fired before, and they always found a way back. But not her. At every interview, she saw the same reaction. A slight pause, a hesitant glance at her file, and then the dreaded words, "We've decided to go in another direction." And your history presents a challenge for us. We're looking for someone with a different experience level. She knew what they meant. No one wanted to hire her, and without a bum, her savings drained fast. She downgraded her apartment, stopped going out. She sat alone, watching the world move on while she stayed stuck in place. One night, unable to sleep, Linda did something she hadn't done before. She rewatched the videos. At first, she felt rage. The way Carla stared her down, unshaken. The way James recorded everything, cool and composed. She wanted to scream at the screen, "You weren't supposed to fight back." But then she saw herself, really saw herself, the way she stood over them, the way she spoke down to them, the way her tone was colder, sharper, different than when she spoke to other passengers. She noticed how quickly she assumed they were in the wrong, how easily she dismissed Carla's calm explanations, how furious she became when James simply refused to react. She had seen them as a problem before they even spoke. Her stomach twisted, because for the first time, she couldn't ignore the truth. For weeks, Linda avoided looking deeper. But the guilt, the shame didn't go away. So she started reading. At first, she told herself it was just to prove she wasn't a bad person. She attended a workshop on bias in the workplace. She listened to stories from people who had faced discrimination. She started seeing patterns in her past behavior. And it hurt, because she wasn't just guilty of what happened on Flight 387. She had done this before. She had questioned other passengers who didn't look like they belonged. She had assumed people were lying before checking facts. She had felt powerful when enforcing authority because it made her feel important. Now she felt small. One night she sat down and wrote a letter. Not a PR move, not an excuse, an actual apology. To Carla, to James, to the passengers she had mistreated over the years. She didn't expect forgiveness. She just needed to say it. When she hit send, she exhaled, tears burning her eyes. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was running. Linda lost everything because of one flight. But was it just one flight? Or was it a lifetime of unchecked power finally catching up to her? Can people change? Can they learn from their mistakes? Or is some damage too deep to undo? What do you think? Should Linda get a second chance? Or was her downfall deserved? Drop a comment below. Like, if you believe in accountability and change, subscribe for more powerful stories like this. The echoes of Flight 387's controversy didn't fade with time. They became a turning point that changed the airline industry, corporate accountability, and the lives of everyone involved. For Carla and James, what began as an unjust humiliation in first class became a battle for justice that extended beyond them. They hadn't just stood up for themselves. They had fought for everyone who had ever been mistreated, overlooked, or wrongly accused. And they won. But for Puya de Scott, the disgraced flight attendant, the road was much longer and much harder. The airline had no choice but to change. After weeks of public scrutiny, the board released a formal statement, not just apologizing, but announcing sweeping policy reforms to prevent anything like this from happening again. Mandatory bias training for all flight crews, emphasizing fair treatment of all passengers. A new accountability system, ensuring flight attendants couldn't unjustly remove passengers without proper justification. A customer protection committee, led by an independent review board to handle discrimination complaints with transparency. Carla wasn't satisfied with just words. She made sure they followed through. When the airline invited her to consult on the policy changes, she accepted, not because she wanted revenge, but because she wanted to make sure this industry truly evolved. She attended meetings with executives, sat in on training sessions, and pushed for real enforcement of the new rules. This wasn't just about one flight anymore. It was about every person who had ever been treated unfairly in a place they had every right to be. And the impact spread. Other airlines took notice. Within 6 months, multiple competitors implemented similar policies, afraid of becoming the next public scandal. Carla hadn't just changed one company. She had changed the game. With their mission accomplished, James and Carla were finally able to return to a sense of normalcy. But they would never be the same. One afternoon, as they sat in their sunlit home, James scrolled through an article titled, "How One Couple Changed Airline Policy Forever." He chuckled, turning to Carla. "We're history now." She smirked, sipping her tea. "I prefer living legends." Though their legal battle had ended, their voices remained stronger than ever. Carla was invited to speak at leadership conferences, sharing her insights on bias, corporate responsibility, and the importance of standing up for what's right. James wrote a series of articles shining a light on similar injustices happening in other industries. They had become symbols, not because they sought fame, but because the world needed to see what real strength looked like. Not the kind of strength that controls others, but the kind of strength that refuses to be controlled. While James and Carla thrived, Linda Scott faced the hardest year of her life. Her termination was public. Her reputation was destroyed. She had applied to every airline she could think of, hoping for a second chance. But no one wanted to hire her. She had been the face of an industry scandal, and for the first time in her life, she was the one being judged. One day, sitting in a quiet cafe, she overheard two people whispering nearby. "That's her, the flight attendant from that viral story." "Yeah, lost everything. Serves her right." She gripped her coffee cup tightly, her chest tightening. So this is what it feels like, she thought. She had once dismissed passengers without a second thought, and now she was being dismissed just the same. For months, she stayed in denial, telling herself she had been unfairly punished. But then, late one night, she rewatched the viral video, the one that had cost her everything. She saw herself towering over Carla and James. She heard the sharpness in her own voice. She watched her own arrogance, her refusal to listen, and for the first time, she felt ashamed. Because it wasn't just one mistake. It was years of behaving this way. Years of thinking her authority made her untouchable. She had been wrong, and she had hurt people because of it. She needed to change. Not because she wanted her job back, but because she wanted to be better. She took classes on bias awareness. She volunteered with advocacy groups, hearing stories from people who had experienced discrimination firsthand. And after months of self-reflection, she made a decision. She would use her own story to teach others. Linda began giving talks to new flight attendants, warning them about the dangers of unchecked power. She told them, "I was the cautionary tale. I thought I was enforcing rules, but I was enforcing bias. Don't make my mistake." It didn't erase what she had done, but it was a start. A year later, James and Carla boarded a flight for their anniversary trip. As they stepped onto the plane, a flight attendant greeted them. A young woman, smiling warmly, took their tickets. "Welcome aboard, Mr. and Mrs. Carter. We're honored to have you flying with us today." Carla raised an eyebrow, exchanging a look with James. The flight attendant lowered her voice. "I just wanted to say, what you did changed everything." James smiled. "Good, that was the point." As they took their seats in first class, Carla let out a deep breath. It had been a long fight. But now, sitting in their seats, belonging exactly where they were, she knew it had all been worth it. True power isn't about control, it's about integrity. Assumptions can be dangerous. Always look at the facts before making a judgment. If you see injustice, stand up against it. Even small actions can create big change. And when you make a mistake, own it, learn from it, be better. What do you think? Do people like Linda deserve second chances? Should more companies take accountability like this airline did? Let us know in the comments below. Like if you believe in standing up for what's right. Subscribe for more powerful stories that will inspire and challenge you. And remember, you have more power than you think. Use it wisely.